The morning of February 17th, 1944, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the flag bridge of USS New Jersey, watching the horizon where Truk Lagoon lay hidden beyond the curve of the Pacific. Beside him, the massive battleship Iowa cut through the water at 30 knots, her 9 16-inch guns trained forward, ready for action. For months, American intelligence had painted Truk as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, an impregnable fortress where Japan's combined fleet sheltered behind a barrier reef and 5 heavily defended airfields. What Spruance and his officers didn't know was that the fortress was already hollow. The great battleships Yamato and Musashi had fled a week earlier. The carriers had vanished to Palau, but 45 merchant ships, tankers, and smaller warships remained, along with 270 aircraft and nearly 5,000 Japanese personnel. The psychological impact of what was about to unfold would prove as devastating as the physical destruction, shattering Japanese assumptions about their strategic depth and forcing a complete reassessment of their defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American naval power penetrated the heart of Japan's island empire begins not with battleship guns, but with reconnaissance photographs and intelligence assessments that revealed a fundamental truth. Japan's mighty fortress was vulnerable in ways its defenders had never imagined. In early 1944, the United States Navy faced a strategic challenge that would determine the pace of the entire Pacific offensive. The Marshall Islands campaign had succeeded beyond expectations. Kwajalein fell in early February, giving American forces a forward base 1,500 miles closer to Japan than Pearl Harbor. But Truk Lagoon, lying 700 miles further west in the Caroline Islands, presented both an obstacle and an opportunity. Japanese planners had fortified Truk throughout the 1930s, transforming a natural deep-water anchorage into what they believed was an unassailable naval base. The atoll's barrier reef stretched 40 miles in diameter, enclosing a lagoon large enough to anchor hundreds of ships. 5 airfields dotted the islands within the reef, providing land-based air cover, submarine pens, fuel storage facilities capable of holding 17,000 tons of oil, repair shops, and communications centers made Truk the logistical hub, supporting every Japanese garrison from the Marshalls to New Guinea. American naval intelligence had tracked Japanese fleet movements through signals, intercepts, and submarine observations, but they lacked detailed knowledge of Truk's defenses. The atoll had been closed to foreigners since the League of Nations mandated it to Japan after World War I, pre-war. Estimates, colored by Japanese propaganda about their Gibraltar, suggested the base might be defended by 30,000 troops, hundreds of heavy anti-aircraft guns, and radar-guided fire control. The truth was far different, though neither side fully understood this in early February 1944. On February 4th, a lone Marine Corps PB-4Y Liberator bomber flying from Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, a distance of 850 miles, approached Truk at high altitude. The 4-engine reconnaissance aircraft carried cameras instead of bombs. What its crew photographed would transform American strategic planning. The photographs revealed battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and dozens of auxiliary vessels crowded into Truk's anchorages. Intelligence officers in Pearl Harbor counted approximately 60 major warships and merchant vessels. Here was the combined fleet, Japan's primary striking force, concentrated in a single location. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, saw immediately that Truk represented a target of opportunity that might not appear again. But the Japanese saw the Liberator. Radar operators on Truk tracked the high-flying reconnaissance plane, and within hours, Admiral Minachi Koga, who had inherited command of the combined fleet after Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death in 1943, understood that Truk's secret was compromised. The appearance of American long-range reconnaissance meant only one thing: a major attack was imminent. Koga faced a decision that would define the remainder of Japan's naval war. Japanese naval doctrine, refined over decades and validated by victory at Tsushima in 1905, demanded that the battle fleet be preserved for the decisive engagement. Battleships were not to be risked in defensive operations or subjected to enemy air attack without the possibility of a decisive counterattack. The doctrine, known as Kantai Kessen, or decisive, battle required that Japan's numerically inferior fleet be husbanded carefully, committed only when conditions favored a climactic engagement that would destroy American naval power in a single blow. Truk, for all its fortifications, could not protect the fleet from a major carrier raid. Koga had watched American carrier aviation grow stronger with each passing month. Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, now fielded 9 fleet and light carriers capable of launching over 500 aircraft. Without carrier air cover to match American strength, Truk's land-based fighters would be overwhelmed. The atoll's 40 anti-aircraft guns, none equipped with radar fire control, could not generate sufficient defensive fire to stop massed air attacks. Between February 7th and 10th, the fastest elements of the combined fleet departed Truk. Battleships, Yamato and Musashi, the most powerful battleships ever built, steamed for Palau. Fleet carriers withdrew to safer anchorages. Heavy cruisers dispersed. Koga himself departed, leaving behind a garrison force, merchant vessels that were too slow to outrun a carrier raid, and the logistical infrastructure that sustained Japan's forward defensive positions. The withdrawal saved Japan's major warships, but it created a situation fraught with psychological danger. By abandoning Truk without fighting, Japanese naval doctrine implicitly conceded that air power had made even heavily fortified bases untenable. The decisive battle for which the fleet had been preserved might never come, because American carrier aviation could strike anywhere with impunity. Admiral Nimitz ordered Operation Hailstone, the attack on Truk, to proceed. It would neutralize Truk as an operating base, preventing Japanese forces from interfering with the imminent invasion of Eniwetok Atoll. It would provide Task Force 58 with combat experience in a major fleet operation. Most importantly, it would demonstrate to Japanese commanders that no base within 2,000 miles of American-controlled territory was safe from attack. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the 5th Fleet, the organizational designation used when Spruance led operations. The same ships, when commanded by Admiral William Halsey, became 3rd Fleet. Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, operated under Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, who had recently replaced Rear Admiral Charles Pownall. Nimitz's staff considered Pownall insufficiently aggressive. Mitcher, a naval aviator since the 1920s, understood carrier operations intimately and had no qualms about taking risks when the strategic situation demanded boldness. Task Force 58 approached Truk with overwhelming force. 5 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, formed the striking arm. 4 light carriers, Belleau-Wood, Cabot, Monterey, and Cowpens, provided additional air groups. 6 fast battleships, including Iowa and New Jersey, the newest and most powerful in the American fleet, screened the carriers against surface threats. 10 cruisers and 28 destroyers completed the task force. The carriers alone could launch over 500 aircraft. Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters had entered service 6 months earlier, giving American naval aviation a fighter that could match the legendary Zero in speed and maneuverability, while surpassing it in ruggedness and firepower. Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers provided strike capability. Critically, Task Force 58 brought sufficient numbers to sustain operations for 2 full days, rotating air groups to maintain constant pressure. Spruance divided his command. 3 carrier task groups, under Mitcher's direct control, would launch the airstrikes. Spruance himself would command Task Group 50.9, a surface action group built around the fast battleships Iowa and New Jersey. Their mission was to circle Truk, intercepting any ships attempting to escape the lagoon and providing naval gunfire support against shore installations. The plan reflected American confidence in their material superiority. Japanese doctrine required preserving precious warships for the decisive battle. American doctrine accepted that warships would be risked even damaged, in the pursuit of operational objectives. Spruance was willing to expose his flagship and the newest battleship in the fleet to possible submarine attack, coastal defense guns, and air attack, because the strategic prize, the neutralization of Truk, justified the risk. On February 11th, Spruance conferred aboard New Jersey with Mitcher, Admiral Willis Lee, who commanded the fast battleship force, and Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who led amphibious operations. The meeting established coordination procedures. Carrier strikes would begin at dawn on February 17th. Spruance's subsurface group would commence their sweep simultaneously, ensuring that no Japanese vessel could escape under cover of darkness. The approach to Truk required careful navigation to avoid Japanese search patterns. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes, knew the timing and sectors of enemy reconnaissance flights. Task Force 58 approached from directions Japanese search planes did not cover, timing their movements to arrive at the launch point under cover of darkness on February 16th. At 2100 hours on February 16th, Task Force 58 reached its launch point 90 miles northeast of Truk. The carriers slowed to launch speed. Flight deck crews began spotting aircraft for the pre-dawn fighter sweep. Pilots received final briefings. Intelligence officers provided target folders showing the layout of Truk's airfields, the locations of anti-aircraft concentrations, and the anchorages where reconnaissance had identified ships. Intelligence officers could not tell the pilots was that Japanese forces on Truk were unprepared for the scale of the attack about to fall upon them. The island's radar could not detect low-flying aircraft, a vulnerability Allied intelligence had identified and planned to exploit. The 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas, Japan's garrison air units, had been on high alert since the February 4th reconnaissance flight, but had stood down after several days without contact. Shore leave had been granted. Crews were scattered across the islands. At 04:45 hours on February 17th, 74 Hellcat fighters launched from the carrier decks. They flew through darkness, navigating by dead reckoning toward an enemy base that had no idea they were coming. The fighters would arrive at dawn, sweeping Truk's airfields to destroy Japanese aircraft before they could become airborne. Behind them, waves of torpedo bombers and dive bombers prepared to launch, targeting the ships crowded in Truk's anchorages. Simultaneously, Spruance's surface action group began its high-speed run around Truk's perimeter. Iowa and New Jersey, capable of 33 knots, raced ahead of the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans. 4 destroyers, Izard, Charette, Burns, and Bradford, screened the formation. The light carrier Cowpens provided combat air patrol, fighter coverage against any Japanese aircraft that might threaten the surface ships. The morning twilight revealed Truk's islands low on the horizon. From Iowa's bridge, officers could see smoke already rising from the airfields as the Hellcat sweep tore through Japanese defenses. Radio communications crackled with reports from the fighter pilots. Minimal resistance. Dozens of aircraft destroyed on the ground. Surprised Japanese pilots attempting to reach their planes were strafed by the sweeping Hellcats. At 0600 hours, the first torpedo bombers and dive bombers arrived over Truk Lagoon. What they found exceeded the expectations set by the February 4th reconnaissance. Ships filled every anchorage. Light cruisers, destroyers, submarines, fleet oilers, ammunition ships, transports and cargo vessels lay at anchor, many with steam down, unprepared for immediate action. The attack began with clinical efficiency. Torpedo bomber pilots selected targets, coordinating their approaches to strike from multiple angles simultaneously, preventing ships from maneuvering to avoid torpedoes. Dive bombers rolled in from 12,000 feet, releasing their 1,000-pound bombs at precise intervals to walk their patterns across ship lengths. The Japanese, caught completely by surprise, responded with anti-aircraft fire that was initially disorganized and ineffective. The light cruiser Naka, attempting to escape the lagoon through the North Pass, became one of the first casualties. Multiple waves of dive bombers from Bunker Hill and Cowpens struck her amidships. A bomb penetrated her machinery spaces, stopping her engines. A torpedo strike broke her keel. She sank within minutes, taking 240 crew members with her. 210 were rescued by nearby vessels. Inside the lagoon, the destruction accelerated. The fleet oiler Shinkoku Maru, carrying 10,000 tons of fuel and aviation gasoline, exploded when a torpedo detonated her cargo. The fireball rose 5,000 feet, visible from 70 miles away. Burning fuel spread across the water surface, igniting nearby ships. The fleet oiler Hoyo Maru and tanker Fujisan Maru caught fire from the spreading conflagration. American pilots, rotating through the target area as fresh strikes launched from the carriers, found a target-rich environment beyond anything they had experienced. The standard doctrine called for each aircraft to make a single attack pass, then withdraw. But over Truk on February 17th, with ships everywhere and resistance diminishing, pilots made multiple attack runs, expending their full bomb and torpedo loads before returning to the carriers. By mid-morning, Truk Lagoon resembled a maritime graveyard. Ships listed at anchor, their hulls torn open by torpedoes and bombs. Others burned furiously, their cargoes of ammunition detonating in secondary explosions. The airfields, pounded by successive bomber strikes, resembled cratered moonscapes. Hangars collapsed under direct hits. Fuel storage tanks burned. The seaplane base on Moen Island, headquarters of the 4th Fleet, took repeated hits that left its facilities in ruins. Outside the lagoon, Spruance's Surface Action Group stalked escaping ships. At approximately 0800 hours, Iowa's radar detected several contacts north of Truk, fleeing at high speed. The contacts resolved into Japanese warships that had escaped the lagoon before the airstrikes began, or were attempting to break out during the confusion. The lead contact was the light cruiser Katori, a training cruiser of limited combat capability but still a valuable warship. Accompanying her were the destroyers Maikaze and Nowaki, the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru, and the minesweeper trawler Shonan Maru No. 15. These ships represented the only Japanese surface forces attempting to contest the American attack. Spruance ordered his task group to close for engagement. This was the moment Iowa and New Jersey would finally fire their main batteries in anger against enemy surface vessels. Since their commissioning in February and May of 1943 respectively, both battleships had screened carriers and bombarded shore positions, but they had never engaged enemy warships in a surface action. Iowa accelerated to full speed, her engineering plants delivering 112,000 horsepower to her 4 screws. The rangefinders in her Mark 38 fire control system tracked the Japanese ships. At 35,700 yards, over 20 miles, New Jersey fired, the first salvo. The 9 16-inch guns of her forward and after turrets hurled 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells toward the fleeing destroyer Nowaki. The shells, traveling at 2,600 feet per second, took nearly a minute to cover the distance. Fire control radars tracked their fall. The salvo straddled Nowaki, one shell landing port side, another to starboard. Neither hit, but the accuracy at that extreme range stunned the Japanese. Nowaki immediately began evasive maneuvers, zigzagging to throw off American fire control. This was the longest-range straddle in naval history, a demonstration of American fire control technology that would never be repeated. The engagement established that Iowa-class battleships, using radar-directed fire control, could accurately engage targets at ranges exceeding anything the Japanese could achieve with optical rangefinders. But hitting a maneuvering destroyer at 20 miles proved impossible, even with radar. The battle would have to close. Katori, realizing she could not outrun the American battleships, turned to fight. This was a death sentence, but Japanese naval doctrine demanded that warships not surrender or flee ignominiously. At approximately 0900 hours, as Iowa closed to 12,000 yards, Katori fired torpedoes. The Long Lance torpedoes, each carrying a 1,000-pound warhead, raced toward Iowa at 49 knots. Iowa's lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes. Captain John McCrayer, commanding Iowa, ordered emergency turns. The massive battleship, 887 feet long and displacing 57,000 tons at combat load, heeled into a hard turn to port. Her speed and the skill of her helmsman saved her. 3 torpedoes passed close aboard, 1 down the port side, 1 close astern, 1 100 to 200 yards ahead. All 3 missed, but the action reminded every man aboard that Japanese torpedoes remained deadly even when fired from an outmatched opponent. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Iowa responded with her main battery. At 12,000 yards, her armor-piercing shells could penetrate any armor Katori possessed. The first salvo fired at 0915 hit. 46 16-inch shells would be fired at Katori over the next 20 minutes. Each salvo of 9 shells, fired from 3 triple turrets, created a pattern approximately 200 yards long. With Katori maneuvering desperately but unable to escape, multiple shells struck home. The 16-inch armor-piercing shell, when it struck, delivered catastrophic force. Each projectile weighed 2,700 pounds. Upon impact with armor, the hardened steel penetrator punched through, and the explosive filler detonated inside the target, creating massive internal damage. Katori's thin cruiser armor, designed to protect against destroyer, guns and shell splinters, provided no defense against battleship fire. A direct hit on Katori's forward turret destroyed the gun mount and ignited ready ammunition. Fire spread through the superstructure. Another hit penetrated the engine room, stopping her engines. Katori slowed, then stopped, dead in the water and burning. American cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans closed to finish her with 8-inch gunfire. Katori rolled over and sank at approximately 1000 hours, taking most of her crew with her. The auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru, a converted merchant vessel armed with 8-inch guns, took 3 bombs from American carrier aircraft during the engagement and drifted helplessly. American cruisers destroyed the destroyer Maikaze with concentrated 8-inch fire. The destroyer Burns dispatched Shonan Maru No. 15 with 5-inch gunfire. Only the destroyer Nowaki escaped, using her superior speed and maneuverability to break away while Iowa and New Jersey engaged. Katori. The engagement demonstrated both the power and limitations of battleship gunnery. Iowa's 16-inch guns, the most modern naval rifles in the world, could engage targets at ranges exceeding 20 miles. But actually hitting a maneuvering target at that distance remained nearly impossible despite radar fire control. At closer ranges, 12 to 15,000 yards, the guns proved devastatingly effective against light cruisers and destroyers that could not respond with equal force. The surface engagement off Truk represented the only time Iowa-class battleships would fire their main batteries against enemy warships during World War II. The action lasted approximately 90 minutes and resulted in the sinking of 1 light cruiser, 1 destroyer, 1 auxiliary cruiser, and 1 minesweeper. Iowa herself expended 331 16-inch rounds and 1,678 5-inch rounds. The expenditure of ammunition was significant, but the strategic impact of the surface action was minimal compared to what carrier aviation was accomplishing inside Truk Lagoon. While Iowa and New Jersey pursued escaping ships, carrier aircraft continued their systematic destruction of Japanese forces trapped in the atoll. The scale of the aerial assault exceeded anything previously attempted in the Pacific War. By noon on February 17th, American carriers had flown over 500 sorties. Pilots reported target saturation. Every ship in the lagoon appeared to be hit, sinking, or burning. The airfields were cratered and unusable. Fuel storage facilities burned with fires that would continue for days. Japanese attempts at aerial counterattack proved futile. The pre-dawn fighter sweep had destroyed most of the garrison aircraft on the ground. The survivors, attempting to take off from damaged runways or launching from the seaplane base, were intercepted by combat air patrols of Hellcat fighters orbiting the atoll. Japanese pilots, many inexperienced replacements rushed forward after the devastating losses at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, were still 6 months in the future. found themselves outmatched by American pilots flying superior aircraft. The aerial combat over Truk was one-sided. American pilots claimed 70 Japanese aircraft shot down on February 17th. Actual Japanese losses, verified by post-war records, exceeded 250 aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air. The disparity reflected both the effectiveness of the initial fighter sweep and the overwhelming numerical superiority American carrier aviation now enjoyed. By evening of February 17th, Task Force 58 had accomplished its primary objectives. Truk's air power was destroyed. Shipping in the lagoon was devastated, but Admiral Spruance, mindful of the need to complete the neutralization, ordered operations to continue through February 18th. The decision proved prescient. During the night of February 17th to 18th, small groups of Japanese bombers flying from Truk and from Formosa, over 1,000 miles to the northwest, attempted to strike the American carriers. The attacks came in waves between 2100 hours and just after midnight. Japanese pilots, flying by moonlight and navigating by dead reckoning, searched for Task Force 58, spread across hundreds of square miles of ocean. At approximately 22:30 hours, a lone Rico-type twin-engine bomber from the 755th Naval Air Group penetrated the screening destroyers and attacked Task Group 58.2. The bomber, flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection, achieved complete surprise. Its torpedo struck the fleet carrier Intrepid on the starboard quarter, jamming the steering gear and killing 11 sailors. Intrepid's damage was severe enough to require withdrawal from the combat zone. The carrier, flagship of Task Group 58.2, would spend the next 6 months in American shipyards undergoing repairs. She would not return to combat until August 1944. The attack demonstrated that even overwhelming American superiority could not guarantee complete protection against determined Japanese airmen willing to sacrifice themselves for a single hit. The loss of Intrepid was the only significant damage sustained by American forces during Operation Hailstone. 25 aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft fire and operational accidents. 40 Americans were killed, including 29 aircrew and 11 sailors aboard Intrepid. Against these losses, the destruction inflicted on Japanese forces was catastrophic. Dawn on February 18th brought a second day of strikes. 57 Hellcat fighters conducted another sweep at first light, encountering virtually no aerial opposition. The dive bombers and torpedo bombers that followed found Japanese forces on Truk in a state of near collapse. Ships that had survived, the first day's attacks with damage were finished off. The few vessels that had escaped into smaller anchorages around the atoll were hunted down. Shore installations received repeated bombardment. The destroyer Oite, which had been escorting the light cruiser Agano when that ship was torpedoed by the submarine Skate on February 16th, returned to Truk on February 18th, unaware that Operation Hailstone was underway. The destroyer, carrying survivors from Agano, entered Truk Lagoon to find the base under massive attack. American aircraft immediately pounced on the isolated destroyer. Oite was sunk with heavy loss of life, including many of the Agano survivors she was attempting to rescue. By mid-morning February 18th, American pilots reported that no worthwhile targets remained. Every major ship in the lagoon was sunk or sinking. The airfields were destroyed beyond immediate repair. Fuel storage facilities burned. The submarine base was wrecked. The seaplane base on Moen Island, headquarters of the Fourth Fleet, was in ruins. Admiral Mitcher, having accomplished every objective assigned to Task Force 58, recommended withdrawal. Admiral Spruance concurred. Japanese air attacks during the previous night had demonstrated that remaining in the area after dark invited counterattacks. American forces, having achieved overwhelming success, should not risk further losses to diminishing returns. At 1200 hours on February 18th, Task Force 58 retired to the east, heading for Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands to refuel and rearm before the next operation. The two-day assault on Truk inflicted damage that exceeded Pearl Harbor in scale and strategic impact. American aircraft and surface ships sank 45 Japanese vessels, totaling over 200,000 tons of shipping. 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, 3 auxiliary cruisers, 2 submarine tenders, 3 submarine chasers, and 32 merchant ships and tankers were destroyed. Over 250 aircraft were wrecked. 90% of Truk's fuel reserves burned. Approximately 4,500 Japanese military personnel were killed. The shipping losses represented nearly 1/10 of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost between November 1943 and June 1944. At this stage of the war, Japan's industrial capacity could not replace such losses. American shipyards were launching new merchant vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Japanese shipyards, starved of steel and struggling under air attack, could barely maintain the existing fleet, let alone replace catastrophic losses. The fuel losses were equally devastating. 17,000 tons of fuel oil and aviation gasoline burned during the 2-day attack. Japanese fuel supplies, dependent on oil from the Netherlands East Indies transported by vulnerable tankers across submarine-infested waters, were already critically constrained. The loss of 5 fleet oilers at Truk further restricted Japan's ability to sustain fleet operations. But the material losses, severe as they were, paled beside the psychological impact of Operation Hailstone. Truk had been portrayed in Japanese propaganda as an impregnable fortress, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, the shield protecting Japan's southern conquests. American intelligence had accepted this assessment, planning cautiously around the assumption that Truk would require extensive preparation before it could be attacked. The reality, revealed over 2 days in February 1944, was that no Japanese base was impregnable against American carrier aviation. The fast carrier task force could strike anywhere in the Pacific, appear without warning, deliver overwhelming force, and withdraw before Japanese forces could respond effectively. The strategic implications were profound. Japanese commanders immediately understood that Truk's fall meant the end of their defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific. Without Truk as a forward base, Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands from the Marshalls to the Bismarcks could not be supplied or reinforced. These garrisons, totaling tens of thousands of troops, would be left to wither on the vine, isolated and irrelevant to the outcome of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff relieved Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, commander of the 4th Fleet based at Truk, 2 days after the attack. Kobayashi was forced into retirement on May 30th, 1944, scapegoated for a defeat that was fundamentally strategic rather than tactical. No commander could have defended Truk successfully against the forces arrayed against it. Admiral Minechi Koga, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, drew different lessons from Truk's destruction. His decision to withdraw the battle fleet before the American attack had saved Japan's remaining carriers and battleships for what he hoped would be a decisive engagement on more favorable terms. But Koga recognized that American carrier aviation had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine, the decisive battle strategy that had shaped Japanese naval planning for 4 decades, assumed that Japan's battle fleet would engage American forces, advancing across the Central Pacific in a climactic gun battle somewhere near the Philippines or the Marianas. Attrition by submarines and land-based aircraft would whittle down American strength during the advance, evening the odds for the decisive engagement. Operation Hailstone demonstrated that this strategy was obsolete. American carrier aviation, not battleships, was the decisive weapon. The fast carrier task force could strike from beyond the range of land-based aircraft, destroy airfields before Japanese planes could launch, and withdraw before surface forces could engage. The decisive battle, if it came, would be fought by aircraft carriers, not battleships. Koga began planning for what would become Operation Ago, the defense of the Marianas. He reorganized the combined fleet, placing carriers at the center of the battle plan with battleships relegated to supporting roles. But Koga would not live to execute his strategy. In March 1944, while flying from Palau to the Philippines, his aircraft disappeared in a storm. His chief of staff, flying separately, crashed near Cebu in the Philippines. The documents he carried, revealing Japanese plans, fell into the hands of Filipino guerrillas and eventually reached American intelligence. Admiral Soemu Toyoda replaced Koga as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Toyota inherited a force that was numerically weaker, operationally constrained by fuel shortages, and strategically on the defensive. The loss of Truk had forced the combined fleet to withdraw to bases in the Philippines and Singapore, further from the anticipated battle zones in the Central Pacific. This increased fuel consumption and reduced reaction time when American forces did attack. For American planners, Operation Hailstone validated the strategy of bypassing heavily fortified positions. Admiral Nimitz had initially considered invading Truk, securing it as a forward base for subsequent operations. Pre-invasion estimates suggested casualties could be high, possibly exceeding the bloody toll at Tarawa, where over 1,000 Marines died, taking a small atoll defended by fewer than 3,000 Japanese troops. The success of the carrier raid made invasion unnecessary. Trucks, neutralized from the air, could be isolated and left to garrison forces that posed no threat to American operations. The same strategy would be applied repeatedly throughout the Central Pacific campaign. Heavily defended islands that would have required costly amphibious assaults were instead bypassed, their garrisons left to starve while American forces advanced toward objectives that actually mattered strategically. The doctrine of island hopping, selecting only essential objectives while bypassing others, accelerated the American advance dramatically. Operations that pre-war planning had estimated would require years were completed in months. By June 1944, just 4 months after Operation Hailstone, American forces invaded the Mariana Islands, placing B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands for the first time. Admiral Spruance conducted a second carrier raid against Truk on April 29th and 30th, 1944. This strike, finding no shipping in the lagoon, focused on destroying the airfields and any remaining aircraft Japan had managed to bring forward. 92 bombs were dropped over a 29-minute period, systematically destroying Japanese attempts to rebuild Truk as a bomber base. After April 1944, no major American operations targeted Truk. The base was simply irrelevant. Truk's Japanese garrison, numbering approximately 12,000 troops at the time of Operation Hailstone, remained on the atoll until Japan's surrender in August 1945. Supply submarines occasionally attempted to deliver food and medicine, but only 7 submarines successfully penetrated American submarine patrols during the final 18 months of the war. The garrison grew crops, fished, and slowly starved, contributing nothing to Japan's defensive efforts. The role of Iowa and New Jersey in Operation Hailstone requires careful assessment. The surface engagement on February 17th represented a minor tactical action compared to the devastating carrier airstrikes. The battleships sank 1 light cruiser and destroyed several smaller vessels, but these losses were insignificant compared to the 40 ships sunk by aircraft inside Truk Lagoon. The true value of the fast battleships lay not in their 16-inch guns, but in their ability to screen carriers while keeping pace with the task force. Iowa and New Jersey could maintain 33 knots for extended periods, matching the speed of fleet carriers during high-speed withdrawals or approaches. Their heavy anti-aircraft armament, 20 quad 40mm mounts and 49 20mm guns at the time of Operation Hailstone, provided significant protection against Japanese air attack. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Iowa formed part of the battle line that helped repel 4 massive Japanese air raids. The battleship's anti-aircraft fire, coordinated with fighter direction from the carriers, created an integrated air defense system that destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft. This role, screening carriers and providing anti-aircraft defense, was the primary mission for which Iowa-class battleships were designed. The surface engagement off Truk, while dramatic, was almost accidental. Spruance had positioned his surface action group to intercept escaping ships, but he had not expected to encounter warships capable of fighting back. The appearance of Katori and the destroyers provided an unexpected opportunity to test Iowa's gunnery systems under combat conditions. The results validated American fire control technology while revealing the practical limitations of long-range naval gunnery. The legendary straddle of Milwaukee, at 35,700 yards, demonstrated that radar fire control could achieve accuracy at ranges that would have been impossible with optical rangefinders alone. But accuracy was not the same as effectiveness. A straddle, with shells landing on both sides of the target, proved the fire control system could hit the right general area, but actually striking a maneuvering destroyer at 20 miles required multiple salvos and considerable luck. At closer ranges, 12 to 15,000 yards, Iowa's gunnery proved devastatingly effective. Katori, engaged at these distances, had no chance of survival. The 16-inch shells, arriving at 3-second intervals, as Iowa's fire control system adjusted aim between salvos, systematically destroyed the light cruiser. Japanese armor, designed to resist 8-inch cruiser shells, could not withstand battleship fire. The comparison between Iowa's 16-inch guns and Japanese heavy armament reveals interesting technical details. Japan's Yamato-class battleships mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever deployed. These massive weapons could throw a 3,200-pound shell out to 26 miles. American intelligence did not learn the true caliber of Yamato's guns until after the war, estimating them at 16 inches based on treaty limitations. Had Iowa and Yamato met in battle, the engagement would have been decided more by fire control than by gun size. Iowa's radar-directed gunnery could engage targets in darkness, fog, or at ranges where optical rangefinders were ineffective. Yamato, relying on optical rangefinders despite having primitive radar, would have struggled to achieve hits under conditions where Iowa could fire accurately. But such an engagement never occurred. Yamato fired her main batteries in anger only once, during the Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944. During that chaotic action, Yamato and several other Japanese battleships engaged American escort carriers and destroyers at ranges where their superior firepower should have been decisive. Yet persistent American air attacks, the courage of American destroyer crews making torpedo runs, and Admiral Takeo Kurita's indecision prevented the Japanese from destroying the vulnerable American carriers. The battle off Samar demonstrated that battleships, even super battleships like Yamato, were vulnerable to air attack and could be driven off by determined opposition even from inferior forces. The age of the battleship as the decisive naval weapon had passed. Carrier aviation, exemplified by Operation Hailstone, represented the future of naval warfare. Iowa's crew, watching Truk burn on the horizon during February 17th and 18th, witnessed the validation of a strategic transformation that had been underway since Pearl Harbor. The destruction of the American battleship fleet on December 7th, 1941, had forced the United States Navy to rebuild around carriers. What began as necessity became doctrine. By 1944, American naval strategy placed carriers at the center, with battleships providing support. Japanese commanders, despite witnessing the same transformation, struggled to abandon battleship-centric thinking. Resources continued to flow toward completing Yamato's sister ship Musashi and planning an even larger Montana-class equivalent, the Super Yamato design. These investments in obsolescent technology drained resources from submarine construction, destroyer production, and carrier aviation, the areas where Japan desperately needed strength. The strategic paralysis that prevented Japan from fully embracing carrier aviation or submarine warfare reflected institutional rigidity that pervaded Japanese military planning. Officers trained to believe in the decisive battle, in the virtue of offensive spirit, and in the superiority of Japanese warriors found it psychologically difficult to accept that material factors, industrial capacity, and technological innovation might outweigh traditional military virtues. Operation Hailstone forced this recognition upon Japanese commanders in a way that previous defeats had not. The Guadalcanal campaign, while ultimately disastrous for Japan, could be explained as a grinding attrition battle lost due to logistical failures. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American fighters destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft, could be attributed to inadequately trained Japanese pilots facing experienced American aviators. But Truk was different. Here was Japan's strongest base outside the home islands. fortified over years, garrisoned by thousands of troops, defended by hundreds of aircraft. And American carrier aviation destroyed it in 2 days with minimal losses. No amount of fighting spirit or tactical skill could have prevented this outcome. The material superiority of the United States, expressed through carrier aviation, was simply overwhelming. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of Operation Hailstone extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The operation demonstrated that the Central Pacific offensive could be sustained, that Japanese bases could be neutralized without costly amphibious assaults, and that American industrial power could generate and sustain offensive operations on a scale Japan could not match. For the crew of USS Iowa, the engagement off Truk represented the only time they would fire their main batteries against enemy warships. The battleship would go on to participate in every major American operation in the Pacific through the end of the war. She screened carriers during the invasion of the Marianas. She participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. She was present at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, though denied the surface action when Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38 was lured north by Japanese decoy carriers. In July 1945, Iowa bombarded the Japanese home islands, targeting steel mills and industrial facilities. Her 16-inch guns, designed to fight enemy battleships, instead destroyed the infrastructure that sustained Japan's war economy. On August 29, 1945, Iowa entered Tokyo Bay. 3 days later, on September 2nd, aboard her sister ship Missouri, Japan signed the Instruments of Surrender, ending World War II. The wrecks of the ships sunk during Operation Hailstone remain in Truk Lagoon, now called Truk Lagoon, preserved in the warm tropical waters. Recreational divers visiting the site can explore the merchant vessels, tankers, and warships that were destroyed in February 1944. The wrecks serve as both a graveyard for the thousands who died during the attack and a museum preserving a moment when American naval power demonstrated its overwhelming superiority. The title that brought us here, suggesting that Japanese generals mocked American 16-inch guns before Iowa obliterated Truk in 72 hours, captures a dramatic narrative but misses the actual historical truth. Japanese military planners never mocked American battleship guns. They understood perfectly well the capabilities of Iowa-class battleships, having designed Yamato specifically to outmatch American capital ships. What Japanese planners failed to understand was that battleships, regardless of gun size or armor thickness, had become supporting players in a new form of naval warfare dominated by carrier aviation. Operation Hailstone was not won by Iowa's 16-inch guns. It was won by 500 carrier aircraft flying from 9 aircraft carriers, demonstrating a level of offensive power that no battleship, American or Japanese, could match. The surface engagement where Iowa sank Katori was a footnote to the main battle, a brief moment of traditional naval combat in an operation that proved such combat was obsolete. The real story of Truk was not about battleship guns, but about the carrier aviation that made those guns largely irrelevant. Admiral Raymond Spruance, reflecting on Operation Hailstone in his post-war writings, emphasized that the operation's success stemmed from careful planning, overwhelming force, and the integration of air and surface elements into a coordinated strike. The battleships performed their assigned role, intercepting escaping ships and providing gunfire support. But the decisive arm was carrier aviation, and Spruance knew this. The transformation of naval warfare, from battleship-dominated engagements decided by gun duels to carrier-based operations where aircraft struck from beyond visual range, was completed by 1944. Operation Hailstone provided dramatic proof of this transformation. Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, fell not to siege or assault, but to 2 days of carrier airstrikes that left the fortress intact but useless, its defenders isolated, and its garrison irrelevant to the war's outcome. Iowa steamed away from Truk on February 18th, her magazines depleted, her crew exhausted, having participated in one of the most one-sided victories in naval history. The battleship's 16-inch guns had proven effective in the limited surface engagement, but the real lesson of Operation Hailstone was that such engagements were anomalies. The future belonged to carriers, and American naval doctrine had fully embraced that future, while Japanese doctrine still clung to the past. The psychological impact on Japanese forces watching Truk's destruction cannot be overstated. For years, Japanese propaganda had assured soldiers and civilians that their defensive perimeter was impregnable, that American forces would be ground down in costly campaigns, that Japanese spirit and superior training would prevail over American material advantages. Operation Hailstone shattered these assurances in the most visible way possible. Truk was not some remote outpost on the edge of the empire. It was the combined fleet's forward base, the logistical hub supporting operations across the Central Pacific, the anchor of Japan's defensive strategy. Its destruction in 48 hours, accomplished with minimal American losses, demonstrated that no Japanese position was safe. If Truk could fall so quickly and completely, what hope remained for more distant, less fortified bases? The answer, as subsequent operations would prove, was no hope at all. American forces advanced with increasing speed after Truk. The Marianas fell in summer 1944. The Philippines were invaded that autumn. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, stepping stones to Japan itself, fell in early 1945. Each successive operation built on lessons learned from earlier campaigns, and Operation Hailstone provided crucial insights into how carrier aviation could neutralize enemy bases without costly invasions. The men who served aboard Iowa during Operation Hailstone returned home after the war, carrying memories of a brief, violent engagement that seemed anticlimactic compared to the massive airstrikes they had witnessed. The battleship's role, screening carriers and engaging the few Japanese ships that attempted escape, was important but not decisive. The decisive blows fell from the sky, delivered by pilots whose names history would mostly forget, but whose collective achievement reshaped the Pacific War. 70 years after Operation Hailstone, historians continue to study the operation as a case study in effective use of overwhelming force, proper integration of air and surface elements, and the importance of intelligence in identifying vulnerable targets. The operation succeeded because American planners understood Japanese dispositions, exploited Japanese weaknesses, and applied force in ways that prevented effective Japanese response. The surface engagement, where Iowa's guns roared in anger, lasted 90 minutes. The carrier strikes continued for 2 days. This disparity tells the essential story of Operation Hailstone and of naval warfare in the mid-20th century. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived, and at Truk Lagoon in February 1944, the transition from old to new was written in fire, steel, and the silent wrecks that still rest on the lagoon floor, monuments to a battle that proved the future belonged to those who controlled the skies above the sea.